This is going to be part Scorsese film, part pro wrestling history. This is a man who was pieces of P.T. Barnum, Vince McMahon, Don King, all of which adds up to 100% carny. A man who was once starving and riding rail cars in hopes of making it, and in the end ran in circles of politicians, celebrities, and global entertainers. This is the batshit insane story of Jack Curley. Before Vince McMahon, before Jim Crockett, before the NWA was even formed, Jack Curley was changing pro wrestling. And he was a very unlikely catalyst for the wrestling world. He wasn't some great, wrestling champion turned businessman. He never held a world title. He was an outsider. Hey yo. But today, you can still see his fingerprints all over pro wrestling. While he isn't in the direct WWE pipeline, Curley's work legitimizing, popularizing, and creatively tweaking pro wrestling, especially in New York, set a path for Jess McMahon, Vince K's grandpappy. Curley paved the road so that Jess McMahon and Vince Sr. could set off a chain of events that will lead to Cody Rhodes coming out at next year's WrestleMania with a Slim Jim logo tattooed on his forehead, which would only be his second worst tattoo Bane got him. Before we get started, let me run down my key sources. First, a big old wall of text of an article from nyprowrestling.com. And my biggest source was the book, Ballyhoo, The Roughhousers, Con Artists, and Wild Men Who Invented Professional Wrestling by John Langby. Transition to the story. Curley was born Jack Armin Schul on July 4th, 1876 in San Francisco to Alsatian parents who had left Europe during the Franco-Prussian War. While he was still young, his family returned to Europe, and Jack spent most of his boyhood in France before coming back to San Francisco for his teenage years. While he was young, Jack developed an interest in boxing, an interest that would Forrest Gump him through the rest of his life. Jack wrapped up high school in San Francisco, then briefly tried out business school before getting bored and finding newspaper work at the San Francisco Chronicle. According to Curley's own recollections, he worked as a copy boy before getting fired for fabricating a story. Apparently, kayfabing the news isn't something that would be allowed until Rupert Murdoch launched Fox News in 1996, but just another way Curley was way ahead of his time. Following this firing, Jack's life got crazy, starting when he found work in the fighting world. And let's back up for a second and remember the timeline we're working with here. This is roughly the 1880s, the early 1890s. Sports were not glamorous. Pro baseball was kind of cruising at this point, but there was no NBA, no NFL, and pro boxing was in the middle of this transition from shady, uber-violent, bare-knuckle fighting to gloves. Pro wrestling was still competing with elephants and rigged ring games for attention at the carnival. Jack would find work at a saloon and shooting gallery of former boxer George LeBlanc, a fighter famous for knocking out Jack Dempsey. Not the super big deal Jack Dempsey from the 1900s that keeps popping up in these episodes for some reason. This was non-Perel Jack Dempsey, one of the earliest world middleweight boxing champions. And non-Perel is actually kind of a funny name since there ends up being a way more famous, better Jack Dempsey. Curley was actually at the match to see George KO Dempsey with a pivot punch, basically a spinning back fist that was maybe not legal to throw. But the glamour and emotion and pops from the crowd hooked Jack Curley forever. Helping LeBlanc run his business showed Jack a whole new world. Curley quickly learned that sports weren't just athletic competition. They were gossip. They were drama. They were handling, even creating media narratives. They were ticket sales. They were underworld friendships, ego management, logistics. Then came Chicago. For Curley's own telling, his big break came in 1893 when he went east, traveling hobo-style riding rail cars to Chicago during the World's Fair. There, he met George Seiler, boxing ref and writer for the Chicago Globe. George hooked him up with boxer Alec Reggins, who Jack seconded or cornered for matches. So again, one more step deeper into the fighting world. However, after work dried up, Jack was essentially homeless, broke, hungry, working odd jobs and gig writing for papers. The 2026 American dream. But then Jack's life changed forever. He found work, again in Chicago, with promoter PJ Carroll, helping in his gym operations, seconding fighters, and learning the promotion game from the ground up. PJ Patty Carroll was a boxer turned promoter, manager, matchmaker operating out of Chicago. Patty also had ties to the criminal underworld. And that's another thing you have to remember about this era of sports. If you pull back the layers, it is incredibly dark and shady. So this isn't a nice little desk job for Jack. This is Henry Hill becoming a Goodfellas. Soon, Jack went from sleeping on park benches to wearing three-piece suits and being friends with Robert De Niro as he helped Carroll run the Pelican Athletic Club. And help is a strong way to put it. Patty left most of the work to Jack, who was an absolute workaholic. This is something I cannot stress enough. Jack Curley is a around-the-clock, 24/7 hustler. This led to Jack getting a first-class education in that seedy underworld of early pro sports. Jack promoted shows, dealt with boxers, marketed, managed egos, spoke to newspapers, and learned to skirt the law. Jack even boxed himself some being the key word. Despite being a big guy for his era, he didn't quite have the eye of the tiger, and he quickly learned that it was much safer and more profitable to be the guy running the show, not the guy getting punched in it. Running with this crew would also lead to Jack's name change. Jacqueus, Schul, became Jack Curley, a reference to his curly hair. Since this era of boxing was brutal, long, bloodfest, with ties to crime and corrupt betting, in a lot of cases, prize fighting was illegal. This wasn't HBO boxing live from the Las Vegas Strip. They fought in barns, back rooms, and boats just parked right offshore. Curley said that he once promoted a show where the ring was 4 dudes holding rope. There is an indie fed doing that right now. So it was a delicate balance. Plug the show enough to draw a crowd, but not so much that you get attention from the police. At least the police, you couldn't slip a 20 to look the other way. Under Carroll, Curley emerged as a carny magician. If a fighter got hurt, he knew how to deal with it. If police threatened a card, he knew how to deal with it. If a fighter disappeared, if the law changed, Curley dealt with it, smooth-talked his way through it, or thought of a pivot. Curley is very much the archetype of that character, the smooth talking, always has something to say, always thinking on his feet, always has a sweet one-liner to bury someone. He said that wrestler Wayne Munn couldn't throw a fit if he had epilepsy. That is a spicy roast. By the 1900s, Jack was managing and promoting a string of fighters and attractions, eventually getting the attention and partnership of Andy Craig, a mobster and political operator. Hey, there's a difference. And I don't want to imply mobster, literally the Italian mafia. I think we're still a decade or so from that really getting going in America, but he was doing some shady mafia shit. And there's several reasons mob types would be tied to boxing. The most obvious, betting, cooking the books, laundering money. It's the same reason the mob got heavily involved in pro wrestling in the 1900s. Cash business without a ton of regulation. Andy's best known joint was the Tivoli. The Chicago Crime Scenes Project says the Tivoli was a meeting place for the South Side's pickpocket crew, with a sports book in the basement and a brothel upstairs. However, Craig wanted a more legitimate business reputation, so he made a deal with Curley, who was managing boxer George Gardner. Craig would be publicly presented as Gardner's manager, while Curley did the actual work and advised Craig on favorable gambling odds. Curley would keep his normal cut of pay and get a percentage of Craig's gambling winnings. And while it wasn't the cleanest money, there was a lot of it. It was life-changing for Jack. Fun little story. As a thank you, Craig ended up buying Jack Curley a very early version of a car. And as he drove it, people would scream at him, "Hey, get a horse!" But Curley and Craig were soon tossed a curveball when in 1903 the Tivoli was shut down by the city of Chicago. And once again, Curley was out of a job. Following this, Jack opened up his own saloon where he held fights, he served drinks, he even gave away free lunches to attract bettors, which you can also do at the new app. Bet on everything, all the time, always, 24/7. A thing's not real if you don't bet on it. Enter promo code Jesus f***ing Christ to receive a 50% deposit bonus that you're absolutely gonna lose because this isn't a charity. They're giving you money because they know you're going to lose your other money. That's how confident they are. Like 1% of gamblers make money on this. Stop it. Stop doing it. Over the next several years, Curley traveled through the country promoting anything he thought would draw a crowd. He went through Montana, Iowa, Chicago, later Seattle, plugging boxing matches, a failed bullfight. Later in his career, he'd even get into swimming, Wild West acts, a Vatican choir, dance marathons, and bicycle races. And most importantly, by 1907, he was starting to get more and more into pro wrestling, which, with the way boxing would be, is crooked and fixed, kind of a lateral move. Jack's first major wrestling promotion was a Frank Gotch vs. Fred Beal match in Chicago on April 26, 1907. And promoting a Frank Gotch match isn't like baby steps easing your way in. Frank Gotch was like the man. And this dive into pro wrestling was not an accident. There was a major crackdown on professional prize fighting in Chicago since the calendar flipped over to the 1900s. The Illinois Supreme Court even upheld Chicago's anti-prize fighting film ordinance in 1909. So promoting and profiting off boxing was getting increasingly difficult. By 1909, Curley was promoting wrestling in Chicago with the Illinois Athletic Club. Curley would later claim he promoted an April 14, 09 match between Frank Gotch and Yusuf Mahmoud that drew over 10,000 people and over $38,000 at Dexter Park Pavilion. Carny pro wrestling math notwithstanding, Jack also became partners with pro wrestler Doc Roller, who has his own crazy story. I think I'll eventually cover him. A real doctor turned pro wrestler. The doctor will break your arm, and then the cost of America's healthcare system will break your life. In 1910, and back in boxing, Curley was part of a group of investors that were attempting to talk ex-champion Jim Jeffries out of retirement for a fight with Jack Johnson. I believe Jeffries was undefeated because he was a racist douche clown that ducked black fighters his entire career. But after Jack Johnson became the first black world heavyweight boxing champion, Jim thought he could use his whiteness to take it back. That led to a Curley brokered match July 4th, 1910, where Jeffries got his ass absolutely f***ing clapped by Jack Johnson. Like, my favorite videos on the internet right now are racists getting dropped with a punch and hitting the ground like a ton of bricks. This is basically the first one of those. Curley had a long relationship with Jack Johnson, which we'll circle back to in a few. But all that's to say, Curley was promoting fights with legends like Jack Johnson, involving the world title. He was big time in boxing. Later in 1910 and back over to pro wrestling, Curley and Doc Roller hopped on a ship to England for what would essentially be a recruiting trip. Overseas, he was able to book Doc Roller against the Great Gama, who was one of the first truly major international wrestling attractions out of India. He also booked the Doc against Stanislas Zabisco in a match that was apparently attended by the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You may know him as the dude who got shot and started World War I, or like the band. Overseas, Jack also ran into George Hackenschmidt, and he convinced him to come back to the US following George's hiatus after his bizarre loss to Frank Gotch in 1908. Curley's idea was that classic big fight cash cow, a rematch. We'll eventually cover Gotch vs. Hack in agonizing detail on Tim Bell Pod, but just know for now, this is basically Rocky vs. Ivan Drago, the all-American homegrown hero versus the dude who was apparently built in a lab to be a foreign muscle man monster. For the rematch, Curley secured Chicago's Kaminsky Park and billed it as the match of the century. On Labor Day, September 4th, 1911, Frank Gotch versus George Hackenschmidt drew the largest gate in pro wrestling history at that point, $87,053, as well as 35,000 fans, a record that would stand for 23 years. And again, please consider carny and pro wrestling math here. These numbers are constantly changing depending on who's telling this story, but since it's a Jack Curley episode, I'll use the most extreme, flowery ones as he would have. So Jack was not just promoting some of the era's most important boxing matches, he also promoted the era's most important pro wrestling match. However, it kind of sucked. Hack ended up getting hurt while training with Doc Roller. He's a doctor. I don't know why he didn't just fix it. But that led to a very uneventful match where Frank Gotch just kind of like dominated him for 2 straight falls in a match that lasted well under 30 minutes, which sounds like that's a big long main event match, but like remember back then they were used to matches going like 2-3 hours, and this basically killed the town. Chicago was pissed about pro wrestling for years after this. But Curley wasn't quite done with boxing or Jack Johnson. On July 4th, 1912, Curley promoted a world title match in Las Vegas between Jack Johnson and Jim Flynn. Las Vegas, New Mexico, you know, the famous one. Jack Johnson dominated the match, and it ended with Flynn getting DQ'd for throwing headbutts and with police hitting the ring. And there's 2 versions as to why. Number 1, the police chief wasn't going to allow this blatant, obvious cheating. Number 2, there was so much racial hostility over Jack being world champion that they knew if the ref called the match without a very decisive KO, that ref very well may be killed. Curley's highest high point in boxing would again involve Jack Johnson and again involve racism. They kinda made a movie about this. That fight would be Jack Johnson versus Jess Willard for the heavyweight title in Havana, Cuba, April 5th, 1950. This fight became one of the major events in this era of boxing, and it has a long, crazy story behind it, which I'm just going to speed run through because this isn't a Jack Johnson episode and this isn't a boxing show. Again, they made a movie about it. Jack Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion, and his reign had produced years of racial hysteria from white America. Willard was a monster that once punched a dude so hard, he died. So quite the marquee matchup. Willard went on to beat Jack Johnson. Whether he took a dive or not is left for history to determine, but Curley became associated with bringing the heavyweight title back to the white race. Book him on your Manosphere podcast. Now, Curley's morality is complicated. Some pretty bad alleged stuff with his first wife, then there's him working with criminals, and then there's Curley dancing around all this racism and profiting from it. But true to his roots, he found an angle to sell something, and he sold it. And I mean, if you're not willing to sell out everything you've ever stood for a payoff, are you even ready to enter the pro wrestling industry? Despite this landmark match, it was around this time Curley found himself squeezed out of the boxing business by former assistant Jack Kearns, who was now manager of the super good, super famous Jack Dempsey, and also promoter Tex Rickard. And Tex and Jack have this long-running, heated, enemy-frenemy relationship that goes across boxing and wrestling and cities. We'll circle back to that in a second. Basically, after the Johnson-Willard fight, Curley tried to stay attached to Willard's drawing power, booking him on tours and circus dates, even pairing him with Frank Gotch. But Willard turned out to be very difficult to work with. Their relationship collapsed into a lawsuit, and Curley walked away with a settlement instead of control of the world heavyweight boxing champion. Then all the boxing attention moved to Jack Dempsey, with Jack Kearns in Dempsey's corner, and Tex Rickard being the promoter with money, buildings, and a national machine. Fans followed the new, cooler champ, who wasn't in the camp of Curley, while the guy who was kinda screwed Jack over and made him look bad. So out of work again, Jack had to pivot again, and he basically went full-time into pro wrestling and moved right into the New York City pro wrestling scene roughly around 1916. New York is where Jack eventually puts it all together. The carny knowledge, the promotional skills, his thoughts on pro wrestling, all are going to form his final Pokemon evolution. But as good as it would be at times, it would be as equally difficult. Curley's first move was to bring in new wrestling sensation and world champion, Joe Stecher. Stecher was very much cut from the same cloth as Frank Gotch, a terrifying Nebraska farm boy who at just 22 years old was already the recognized and/or claimed world heavyweight champion of pro wrestling, armed with his dreaded submission, the leg scissors. Goddamn spot monkeys ruining wrestling. The original plan was to book Stecher against Vladik Zbyszko, who Jack also managed, but Vladik was injured just before the match. Curley had the rush to replace him and landed on the Masked Marvel, Mort Henderson. The Masked Marvel had become this massive sensation from this international tournament held at the Manhattan Opera House, a tournament put together by Sam Rockman. I think I'm going to eventually cover this because it's so damn interesting. But just know, at this time, Mass Marvel was like the man. That massive main event, January 27th, 1916, was a huge success for Curley. He basically piggybacked off the success of the Manhattan Opera House tournament, with pro wrestling drawing in many of the social elite of New York City who had never really seen a pro wrestling match before. They thought it was like this wacky, dangerous form of theater, and I mean, that is what pro wrestling is. Before Jack Curley, New York City had pro wrestling. It had big matches, big wrestlers. They had MSG in the bag. But it was always scattered chaos. There was never one or two promoters or promotions running the city. But what Curley and Rockman did was pull wrestling out of the shadows for the long haul. Pro wrestling no longer had to be held in shady bars near a brothel. They could be held in major venues near a brothel. It could be written about by major New York newspapers. Pro wrestling could become part of the city, which it did. Wrestling in New York has had a well over 100-year relationship. But that didn't happen overnight, and Curley did not do it alone. Billy Sandow, Toots Mondt, Paul Bowser, Jack Pfeffer, and tons of others all became part of it. But Curley was one of the major architects of the big city promoter system. By the 1910s and 20s, the business began moving toward coordinated agreements between promoters. These arrangements were often described as trust, basically an eventually agreed upon form of creative, booking, and talent sharing. Under Curley and Friends' plans, the champion would no longer just be the best wrestler. The champion was the man the promoter could use to draw the most money. The title was no longer just a prize. The title was a booking instrument and a headline on a poster. Cities would become strategically laid out markets, and matches went from the main point being two dudes rolling around in the ring to the main point being attracting and entertaining fans. And Curley has some crazy ideas, man. He pushed for things like one-fall matches, shorter matches, entertainment over slow, real grappling, sharing rosters, and pro wrestling attempting to have one main champion. So while the Gold Dust Trio gets, and deserves, a lot of the praise for kayfabing and rigging matches into these more, elaborate, entertaining spectacles, Curley was helping fix the rules and the presentation of pro wrestling. In late 1919 and early 1920, Curley helped in the build-up of one of wrestling's early super matches, Joe Stetcher versus Earl Caddock at Madison Square Garden, January 30th, 1920. The plan being taking a major step towards a single pro wrestling championship. By this point, Curley saw the real sports world and how they had a champion. Baseball had the World Series, boxing had streamlined their title into basically an undisputed claim, and he wanted to do that with pro wrestling. But as Curley was making progress, it was not all smooth sailing. In 1920, New York brought boxing back under the Walker Law, and with it came a newly empowered New York State Athletic Commission, chaired by old wrestling icon William Muldoon. And Muldoon was not giving pro wrestling any breaks just because he came from it. He was like a total square about this. While Muldoon had real credibility as an old Greco-Roman wrestling champion, he also wasn't quite innocent as far as fake wrestling goes. And I could see this being kind of like 4D chess, where if a real wrestling champion gained power through some sort of athletic commission, if it was real, he would do everything to protect it from anything considered fake. But also at the same time, I just think William Muldoon was like the first old man yells at cloud about that's not how we did it back in our day, and had the power to be a dick about it. The commission started tightening the screws on pro wrestling, licensing athletes, overseeing cards, even banning major holds like the stranglehold headlock, leg scissors, and the toe hold. It really seemed like anything old Willie didn't like, it was gonna get banned. Imagine the most bitter old-timer wrestler on a podcast, but he has the power to ban all the things he complains about. An even worse break for Jack, in 1921, Curley's old rival, Tex Rickard, was moving to take control of wrestling in Madison Square Garden, and he froze Curley out of the city's biggest arena. And while this almost killed Jack financially, you're not going to out-carny Jack Curley. But December 29th, 1923, maybe through the politicking of Jack Curley, maybe not, the commission's license committee denied Tex a wrestling permit at Madison Square Garden and sided with Curley, who got his own New York license on January 22nd, 1924. This opened Jack up to once again dominate, and he absolutely would, as he gave pro wrestling its first god-tier major star of this new era, Jim Londos. This was Hogan before Hogan, Sammartino before Sammartino. Londos was one of the great drawing wrestlers in wrestling history, a Greek-American star who had the looks, charisma, brought a pill. From 1930 to 1934, Jim and Jack lit pro wrestling on fire. But as Jim got bigger and bigger and bigger, Curley got less and less and less power over him, and their relationship soon started forming cracks. By the mid-30s, contract issues, management disputes, and promotional conflicts began fracturing the business. Londos and his manager Ed White wanted more control. But this wasn't the only wall Curley nor New York Pro Wrestling would run into during the mid-30s. By the 1930s, the media and fans, for very much not the first time, were openly discussing the idea of wrestling being rigged, and also there being some sort of controlling wrestling fraternity, a shadow cabal of promoters determining the outcome of matches, man. Outside promoters and outside pro wrestlers also started complaining about the wrestling trust. So as Curley helped work on the style, as he organized pro wrestling, that organization of pro wrestling kind of made it feel fake. One of Curley's biggest contributions was understanding that wrestling needed to change for bigger venues. Long technical wrestling matches may appeal to purists and gamblers, but in a major urban arena, especially from the balcony, subtle mat wrestling was just a couple of dudes hugging each other for upwards of 2, 3, 4 hours. Curley understood that the product had to become more visible to live audiences. Curley wanted to consistently use recognizable names. He wanted repeatable events and attractions. He wanted pro wrestling in big major venues. He wanted to use the newspapers to push angles and kayfabe fans, like he was decades ahead of the game here. By the late 20s and into the 1930s, Curley and his associates were helping push pro wrestling towards a more dramatic, more animated, more crowd-pleasing style in New York, as the Gold Dust Trio did throughout the Midwest. Then in 1934, the Trust pissed off the one carny who could out-carny the best carny, Jack Pfeffer. After getting pushed out of the New York scene, Pfeffer went to the newspapers and narked. This was an insider telling the general public about rigged matches, about the Trust. Now, papers and fans had questioned the validity of pro wrestling as early as the late 1800s. Pro wrestlers had said that certain matches were fixed. But Pfeffer spilled the beans in one of the most highly organized media outlets in one of the biggest cities in the entire world. All of a sudden, pro wrestling wasn't just suspicious. Shit was just fake. Toss that on top of this being in the middle of the Great Depression, and it was bad for business. With these new public claims, the State Athletic Commission brought the hammer down, and soon pro wrestling was on hard times. And pro wrestling in New York really didn't recover until 48, 49, into the 50s with Antonino Rocca. But Curley wasn't about to admit defeat. He became one of the first promoters that had to navigate wrestling forward through this new fake world. While denying any amount of matches being worked, he kept the heartbeat of wrestling alive, no matter how faint. And a 1934 New Yorker profile captured this by framing Curley as a showman who could profit not just from the belief, but from the disbelief. In other words, pro wrestling under Jack Curley was already becoming sports entertainment. That was part of the fun of it. Fans never needed this to be real. But sadly, as we got deeper into the 1930s, Jack's health had been declining rapidly. Then one night at his home in Great Neck, Long Island, Curley went to bed feeling ill, and while asleep, suffered a massive heart attack. Jack Curley died July 12, 1937, at the age of 61. And after Curley's death, there was basically a huge war over the New York wrestling territory between promoters and bookers and managers and wrestlers. But New York remained central to pro wrestling for, again, 100 years. Eventually, the city became the base of Capitol Wrestling, which turned into the WWF, which turned into the WWF, then WWE. While Curley never directly had a hand in it, he absolutely paved that road. And when people talk about like the greatest promoters in wrestling history, you know, Vince McMahon is obvious. People always bring up Crockett, Paul Bosch, Sam Munchnick, Vern Gagne, Eddie Graham, which are all correct, but Jack Curley is very much in that bloodline. He may not literally be the father of it, but he's at the very least the weird uncle with a gambling addiction. Before Curley and others like him, wrestling could be a special attraction, a sideshow. After Curley, wrestling had a clearer path to becoming a legit part of the overall entertainment industry. Jack Curley helped pull pro wrestling out of the carnivals and fairgrounds and into cities, into the zeitgeist. He helped make Madison Square Garden in New York City a main character in pro wrestling story, decades before either of the Vinces touched it. And most importantly, Jack Curley helped normalize, he helped prove the idea that pro wrestling can survive in this weird middle ground between sports and theater, because that's what pro wrestling always was and what pro wrestling always will be.